the invitation to form a government. At 11:15, the Prime Minister, with his Parliamentary Private Secretary, left number 10 for the last time for his last session of Prime Minister's questions. All smiles, looking pretty relaxed. And once he got there, as we'll discover in a few minutes, he gave quite an astounding and skillful performance. So Tony Blair's last departure within the past hour and a half or so from here, and we expect him back in Downing Street before long, because there's a session, a little party going on in there just to say a final farewell to the Prime Minister and his family. And who knows, we may see the Blair family on the doorstep together once again, in a reminder of that famous image that we had when they came in here. I was stood here in the street watching that happen 10 years ago. Now, just a few minutes ago in the House of Commons, a memorable session of Prime Minister's questions when Mr. Blair faced David Cameron, the Conservative leader, over the dispatch box for the last time. Let's have a look at it.
I'm sure that life in the public eye has sometimes been tough on his family. So can I say on behalf of my party that we wish him and his family well, and we wish him every success in whatever he does in the future.
Let me thank him for those very generous sentiments. And may I say that for all the political disagreements between us, I think it is always important to be able to work with people on issues of national importance across the political divide, and I've always found him most proper, correct and courteous in his dealings with me, and I thank him for that. And although, of course, I cannot wish him well politically, nonetheless, personally, I wish both him and his family very well indeed.
Mr. Blair, in his words at the House of Commons, there were many tributes, by the way, including tributes from lots of opponents, even opponents on his own backbenches, generously saying that he is easily Labour's most successful leader in terms of winning elections. But during that session, all the big issues of the Blair premiership were rehearsed. Iraq and Afghanistan, after the recent losses of life again in both countries, the health service and education, and more besides. Now, over at the House of Commons, we're expecting Mr. Blair to depart in a few moments' time. Everything is ready, and the Outriders ready to accompany the Prime Minister back to Downing Street. Inside the House of Commons, within the Houses of Parliament themselves, the Palace of Westminster, is the BBC's political editor, Nick Robinson, who's, of course, keeping a very sharp eye, as ever, on all these events. It's a very big day, Nick. What did you make of Mr. Blair's performance at his final session of Question Time?
Quite extraordinary scene, Hugh, but not in the way that I expected. The House of Commons, remember, hears, it doesn't clap. If it claps, it doesn't stand for an ovation. It did both those things for Tony Blair. On all sides, MPs of all colours got to their feet spontaneously and applauded him as he walked out of the chamber. And he ended a Question Time quite unlike the one I think he was prepared for, quite unlike the one that his backbenchers desperately wanted to see. They wanted a Thatcher-style bashing of the opposition as they had a go. And David Cameron, in an extremely clever parliamentary performance, sucked all the political heat out of the occasion by asking about the floods, by asking about the Middle East, and then praising Mr. Blair for his achievements and congratulating his family and wishing them well. All the Prime Minister could do was thank him in return, and Labour MPs started to mutter, waiting for a Tory question that would give them the opportunity to see their man take one more swipe at the opposition. He had a little gag when Nick Winterton, Sir Nicholas, raised a question from the Tory benches about an EU referendum, but this was more a sentimental farewell than a long-waited for political bashing.
Prime Minister, back in Downing Street. Tony Blair with his Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, and inside a little reception which has been arranged for those final farewells with the closest members of staff. We saw some of them leaving for Question Time just before it started, including members of the press office and David Hill, his Director of Communications. They're all in there ready for that final little drink session as they say goodbye. And Mr. Blair, after that, we understand, will probably be making his way to the palace, obviously, to see the Queen, and after that, to go up to his constituency in County Durham in Sedgefield, where we expect him to announce that he will stand down as a Member of Parliament with immediate effect. His parliamentary career and his Prime Ministerial career are over at the same time. That's what we're expecting. Now, once Mr. Blair leaves Downing Street here in a short while, we expect him to travel over to Buckingham Palace, where he'll have an audience with the Queen. It's just a short distance away, of course, and he will tender his resignation after he arrives in the courtyard there, and the Queen will, in all likelihood, accept that. And after that, it'll be the signal to summon Gordon Brown. So there'll be a few minutes, if you like, when Britain officially has no Prime Minister, but our Constitution doesn't really allow for great gaps, so there'll be a very swift handover. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is at Buckingham Palace, and he'll be our guide to the protocol and the constitutional process there. Nick, what are we expecting?
The remarkable thing, of course, Hugh, is that all the complexities of this transfer of power from one Prime Minister to another depend upon just a few words being spoken here at Buckingham Palace. As you say, Tony Blair is expected to arrive here. Well, he's expected at about 1:10. He's perhaps a few minutes late now, but at around 1:10 or 1:15, he will arrive here in the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. He will be going in through the King's door there, the door through which he has gone many, many times for his usually weekly audiences with the Queen. He will go up to the Queen's audience room and he will say that he is resigning as Prime Minister. The Queen will accept that resignation. Mrs. Blair will then join them for a short conversation. There are no seals of office to give back. The Prime Minister does not have any seals of office, so it will be a very short process. Tony Blair, with his wife, will then leave again through that door as ex-Prime Minister. He will leave in a different vehicle because he no longer has access, of course, to the Prime Ministerial convoy. And as you say, then just a few minutes later, Gordon Brown will be summoned from the Treasury. He will arrive here again with his wife, who will await in the equerries room while Gordon Brown goes up to the audience room. And again, there's no formality or particular procedure other than that the Queen will invite him to form a government. Now, by convention, the Queen always invites the person who has the confidence of the House of Commons to form a government. He is the leader of the largest party, so it is Gordon Brown who will receive that invitation. There is no kneeling, there is no kissing. Some dramas have depicted Prime Ministers kissing hands with the Queen. That does not happen. He simply accepts that invitation to form a government, and then after again Mrs. Brown will join them, brief conversation, and Gordon Brown then will leave. The first sight that we will have of him as the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be as he emerges there from the King's door, gets into the vehicles, and off he goes down the Mall back to Downing Street as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the 11th Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth's reign.
Nick, we'll be back later on, but thank you very much, and especially for clarifying one thing. Lots of you have been emailing us about this phrase, kissing of hands. Of course, as Nick was making very clear there, it is, if you like, a kind of code. It's a kind of constitutional concept. It doesn't actually happen literally. It used to many years ago, but it doesn't these days. It simply signifies that the offer of the Prime Minister's position has been given and that it's been transferred and accepted. It's a formal confirmation, if you like, that the Prime Minister is in place. Now, today's scene here in Downing Street, if I can just show you what's around me, does remind me of being here back in 1997, because it is packed, absolutely packed, with hundreds of members of the press and media from all around the world, surrounded by colleagues from Spain and other parts of Europe, and of course from colleagues in British broadcasting and press media as well. It's a remarkable scene. There aren't many days where Downing Street buzzes quite in the way it does today. It certainly did in May 97, and it certainly does here today. It's that same kind of feel, though I have to say to you, we are absolutely keeping our fingers crossed for the weather. It looks rather ominously grey overhead, but hopefully it'll keep nice and dry. Now then, we've been talking about Gordon Brown, and of course he is now patiently waiting. He went over to listen to Prime Minister's questions. We saw him there on the front bench alongside Mr. Blair, chatting to Margaret Beckett, the Foreign Secretary. Will she be Foreign Secretary in a day's time? Who knows? These are all the kinds of decisions that Mr. Blair has to take. Carol Walker, our political correspondent, is at the Treasury. Carol, what's the latest word there?
Well, Gordon Brown is back here, having sat and listened to Tony Blair taking Prime Minister's question time for the last time, of course. Next week, he'll be the one standing there at the dispatch box. And for the man who has waited so many years for this moment, the moment when he finally takes over the reins of power, he's got another, perhaps up to an hour or so, to sit and drum his fingers while he waits to be summoned to the palace. But I'm told that he has got a great deal to be getting on with during that time. There are some important Treasury documents that he needs to sign off, parliamentary questions and so on. He's also, I'm told, been receiving some briefing ahead of the conversations he's going to be having later on with some of the world leaders. So a lot to go through and a lot to absorb there. But of course, he's also going to be saying farewell to some of the staff here at the Treasury. He's worked with many of them for 10 years. Many of those staff, of course, will remain here at the Treasury under the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. So there will be some farewells to go through, some thank yous to go through while he waits for that phone call. And I'm told that Robin Janvrin from Buckingham Palace will make the phone call to Gordon Brown's principal private secretary, James Bowler. He will take that crucial phone call from Buckingham Palace, and it's at that point that Gordon Brown will then set off from here, from the Treasury, to go to Buckingham Palace to wait for the Queen to formally invite him to form the next government.
OK, Carol, thank you very much. Carol at the Treasury, and of course we'll be back with Carol a little later on when we get some more movement there. It shouldn't take too long, by the way. That session of Prime Minister's Questions, I think, will be seen as a pretty special one. The last one for Margaret Thatcher, when she was in power, was seen as very, very symbolic of the kind of power that she had, the fact that she relaxed into a great performance. This one with Mr. Blair, I think, will be seen in the same way because he fielded questions very skillfully, he was relaxed, he scored a few important points. Let's have another glimpse at one of the sections of that session. Tony Blair's final session of Prime Minister's Questions, a standing ovation for him, a very generous tribute from his main opponent, the Conservative leader David Cameron, who wished him and his family well, and indeed we expect to see the Blair family leaving Number 10 in the next hour or so, and that of course will be a big moment for them too. A sense of the importance of the day, because not only is the atmosphere building here, but if you just have a quick peep at the end of Downing Street, you'll see that there are very big crowds gathered now at the gate itself. A huge crowd gathered right at the bottom of Downing Street, ready to see Mr. Blair leaving, and of course ready to see Mr. Brown arriving. Quite a crowd being kept out, of course, by those famous gates. Now, Blair versus Cameron is interesting. I've always been told by Mr. Blair's friends that the man he found trickiest to deal with over the dispatch box in his time, in his 10 years as leader, was William Hague, who was the leader up until 2001. And Mr. Hague joins us now from the central lobby of the Palace of Westminster. Mr. Hague, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
What did you make of that remarkable session?
Well, he's always been a great actor, Tony Blair, and I've always joked about the fact that I think he can summon up tears or whatever he wants to summon up whenever he wants to. But actually, looking across at him from a few feet away just now, that there was a tear in his eye that was not part of the act, really. I think he was genuinely very sad to come to the end of that. We, from our point of view, of course, are pretty pleased to see him go because he's the most dangerous opponent that we've had in a couple of 100 years. But he's always been very skilled at Prime Minister's Questions, of course. One has to acknowledge that, and I found it like trying to nail jelly to a wall a lot of the time. He was able to get out of some pretty tight fixes, and that will be a hard act to follow, I think.
It was a strange mix, wasn't it? Because there were some very trenchant criticisms again, people referring to areas that he allegedly hadn't delivered in, and that coupled with some very generous tributes, an odd mix.
Well, I think you're bound to get that on an occasion like this. You know, we want to give credit where credit is due on a day like this, and there is credit due on something like what has happened in Northern Ireland, and David Cameron specifically referred to that. And we wish Tony Blair well if he is going to take on this role in the Middle East as an envoy dealing with the Palestinian situation. Of course, we wish him well with that. We want him and the whole world to be able to succeed with that. So you do get that. But of course, you can't forget forget that at the end of this 10 years, people have lost their pension funds, the NHS is often in an atmosphere of crisis, many things that I think he himself hoped he would achieve, particularly with 3 large parliamentary majorities and a good economic situation that was left to him, have not been achieved. And so you're bound to get the criticism as well.
As we look ahead, Mr. Hague, what will be the dynamics of Cameron versus Brown at question time?
Well, I see it as the past versus the future, really. I don't think Gordon Brown can be the change that the country needs. He's been there over the last 10 years. He has been part of the spin, the author of the stealth taxes and so on. And I see David Cameron very much as the future. And so I think that is going to be really a different dynamic from what we have faced over the last 10 years, because I think Tony Blair was always able to pose for many years as the future against the Conservative Party that had just left office. But now we see a rejuvenated Conservative Party with a very effective leader and a Labour Party that now does carry the baggage of 10 years in office and many of the disappointments that I've just referred to. So we are into a new situation, and I think an exciting one for the country and for the Conservative Party.
William Hague, as ever, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh.
William Hague, the former Conservative leader. Now, if you just joined us here on BBC One and on BBC News 24, we are live this lunchtime to cover the handover of power between Tony Blair, who's just had his last session of Prime Minister's Questions, and Gordon Brown, Britain's longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is, at this moment, we think over in the Treasury, awaiting that call from the Palace to go and be invited by the Queen to form the next administration. That is the sequence of events here. And of course, the crowd's gathering at all the main points, as you can imagine. At the Palace, at Westminster, here in Downing Street, everyone wanting a good vantage point on what's happening today. But this is the best one. If you're here with us on News 24 and BBC One, we have the best vantage point of all. Now we're going to join John Sokol, who's with the Home Secretary, Dr. John Reid.
Hugh, thanks very much indeed. John Reid, am I still calling you Home Secretary?
Yeah, for the next 20 minutes.
Next 20 minutes, and then you stop. Then you're just backbencher Dr. John Reid.
Well, I said I would stand down when Tony stood down as Prime Minister. So for the next half hour or so, I've got all this power and attention, and then after that, I'm a nobody, John.
What did you make of today in the Commons?
Well, I think it was fitting. I've never either experienced or seen anybody in the House of Commons getting a standing ovation. So I think that's a remark. It's an indication of the regard in which Tony is held as a leader, even by his opponents. And I think that's been one of his great qualities. You may or may not like him, but by God, he knew how to lead people.
You were one of those people who, before all this happened, you were urging him to stay on as Prime Minister. Yeah. Is he going too soon?
Well, my view's on the record, and that is that he shouldn't have announced he was going. I thought that debilitated him for a period. And that he ought to have stayed, but he didn't. He made his decision. That's fine. I've made mine. You don't regret it then. You get on with it. And our task now is to make sure that Gordon and the Labour government can face the next generation of big challenges. Because 10 years ago we had unemployment, we had the economy in a bad state, inflation and so on. Nowadays we've got the environment, we've got terrorism, we've got a whole host of new problems, and they'll need a bit of support from the backbenches.
And how do you think that a Brown administration is going to be different from the Blair administration?
Well, one of the great challenges for politicians is that what the public always require is change with continuity. So they want things that are new, but they want the certainty of the old comforts. And I think Gordon's record gives us that idea of continuity, but he's going to have a new style. We've already seen it. We've already got defections from the Conservative Party. He's a substantial, he's got gravitas, he's got leadership, he's a big player. And I think people feel that in terms of security and leadership, he's the man to do it.
And a lot of people are surprised that you, having fought to break up the Home Office so that there was a Justice Department, wouldn't stay on to see it through.
Well, the blueprint is already in place. The three big issues which the Home Office are now facing are the three priorities of people of this country. Manage immigration fairly and effectively, and that is now all been reformed and it's underway. Counter terrorism, and we've now refocused the Home Office to direct our attention towards that and reduce crime. All of that is there, all of the reform programme being put in place, all of it started underway, and it's now up to my successor, whoever Gordon appoints, to carry it through. But I hope in a fairly short period, 14 months, has been a lot done, though there's a bit left to do.
And you said you've got 15 minutes left, I think, as Home Secretary. What are you doing this afternoon and tomorrow?
About half an hour. Well, actually, one of the big things that we were doing yesterday was trying to tackle knife crime. And the last official meeting I had last night was an indication of some of the anguish, personally, that you have to try and address by people. It was a lady called Winnie Johnson, whose son was killed 43 years ago by Brady and Myra Hindley, and we still haven't found the body. And that shows you that some of these challenges which make a difference to people's life, we do pay attention to, and ones like that we ought to. And you know, I'm privileged to have been given that opportunity over the past few years.
Okay, John Reid, thanks very much for joining us. Enjoy your last 15 minutes as Home Secretary. Tony Blair probably just got 15 minutes left as Prime Minister. Hugh, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. And John Reid there, of course, talking about some of the things that he's not been able to achieve, but also listing some of the things that he has. Here in Downing Street, we are awaiting the departure of the Blair family. And while we do that, I'm going to talk to the former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, who's been waiting patiently to talk to us. Mr. Blunkett, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What did you make of that Prime Minister's questions?
Well, I thought it had all the right mixtures of the difficult issues like Iraq, the amusing issues and the tremendous sense of humour that Tony Blair's often displayed at Prime Minister's questions, and a bit of pathos as well. I thought the standing ovation at the end was one of those wonderful moments that the House of Commons can rise to.
And in terms of the standing ovation at the end, even on the opposition side, it seemed pretty genuine.
I think it was. I think people have